you, Member. Member for North Coast.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I've heard quite a bit this morning about the need or the desire for affordable, sustainable ferry system, and yet I've seen little action on that side of the House and how we actually get there. For example, we can use the recent Ferry Commissioner's announcement on March 18th, as well as the government's 10-year transportation plan. There was absolutely no coordination between the two. In fact, there was hardly any mention of the ferry system in the Minister of Transportation's 10-year transportation report.
So much for vision.
So much for a transportation vision and so much for any kind of coordination between the ferry system and the transportation network. What sort of provincial-wide transportation plan doesn't include our BC ferry system? Ferry ridership is at its lowest level, and when the provincial government launched, since its provincial government launched experiment to privatize BC Ferries, fares are going up and services are going down. Ferry fare increases have resulted in a $2.3 billion loss to our provincial GDP over a 10-year period. This is shameful. 31 million passengers have decided to not take a ferry due to these high costs. In fact, I was talking to my brother last night who wants to pay me a visit from Ontario and would like to meet me in Haida Gwaii, and he was absolutely astonished that he could take multiple trips to Hawaii and back for less than one ferry route up the Inside Passage and on to Haida Gwaii. This is cost prohibitive for the average citizen. The Premier has said, quote, "Our #1 focus is to make sure we preserve as low a fare environment as we can to make sure that we don't let fares go up any more." And yet, we're going to see fare increases by nearly 4% on April 1st, a couple of weeks from now, and followed by that, an average of 2%, a 2% increase. For every dollar the federal government spends on BC ferry passengers, $350 is spent per passenger on the East Coast with Marine Atlantic. That's the federal funding for the West Coast ferries relative to the East Coast ferries shows that Marine Atlantic ferries are subsidized $493 per passenger. BC Ferries' federal subsidy is $1.41 per passenger. That's $493 in the East and $1.41 on the West. What is the Minister of Transportation doing to advocate for us in British Columbia? This discrepancy should have the Minister of Transportation outraged. Is he advocating for us? What work is being done here? In Bella Coola, in the Central Coast, where they have now lost their ferry, the Queen of Chilliwack, which took over 100 passengers to the Central Coast, has now been replaced with the 16-passenger vessel, the Nimkish. The minister has quoted this as a world-class tourism product. We've reached our hand out to work in partnership with these communities and these organizations to promote what we believe is a world-class tourism product. Now, Honourable Speaker, I would agree that the communities of the Central Coast, Bella Coola, all the way across the Caribou, Chilcotin, is a world-class tourism destination. But yet these communities have no way of making a living and taking the opportunity of this world-class area. The only tie has been severed that allows this, which is removing the Queen of the Chilliwack ferry and replacing it with the humble Nimkish. These communities, let me remind you, over 2 decades ago, were a heavy forestry industry. These communities were told, basically, under the revisions to how forestry practices were conducted in the Central Coast, to reinvent themselves, to leave the forest industry and reinvent themselves with tourism. In fact, this government provided all sorts of funding for the Central Coast communities to reinvent themselves with tourism. We saw lodges opening up, we saw bear tours, we saw rafting trips, we saw gorgeous ecotourism operations come into existence. And now the one tool that these communities have, the Queen of the Chilliwack ferry, has been severed. So I have constituents in the Bella Coola Valley looking to me with, what do we do now?
Thank you.
What do they do next?
Thank you, Member.